The story I'm about to tell you is true and is deeply connected to my roots. It makes me pretty emotional, and I'm going to try to keep it together over here, and I'm not going to get choked up, or at least I'm going to try. Now, it's not truly weird, but I feel like that I have to tell you this story today. And I had no idea that this had even happened in my family's history or even in South Carolina's history until about 8 years ago.
Triple M Studios and Mystery Murder and Magic proudly present The Weekend Weird Files. Here's your host, Andrea.
Around 2013, I really started working on my family's tree using Ancestry.com. I had always wanted to, and I figured then was as good a time as any, So, you know how it goes, though. You get so far, and then you hit a wall. So when I hit that wall, I posted a plea for help to my family on Facebook. A lot of my mom's cousins pitched in and sent me a lot of good, useful information. One cousin in particular shed some light on my great-great-uncle Thomas Rance Yarber, particularly about his fate. The year was 1934 and the Great Depression was in full swing. Cotton mills were a big thing in the South, but the conditions in them were horrible. The employees worked very long hours in extreme heat for very little pay. Things were no different at the Chicola mill in Honeypath. All over the country, mill workers were organizing as labor unions to help in their quest for better working conditions. And the Chicola workers soon joined them. Soon a strike was called by the National Textile Workers Union. On September the 6th, 1934, 300 strikers surrounded the Chicola mill. The superintendent of the mill was Dan Beecham, and not only was Mr. Beecham the superintendent of the mill, but he was also the town's mayor, municipal judge, and held other roles in the town. Mr. Beecham ordered law enforcement and deputized citizens to handle the protesters. There's some contradicting information about who fired the first shot. No one knows if it was a protester or if it was law enforcement, but several minutes of gunfire took place. In the end, 7 mill workers who were protesting were killed that day as they were running away from the scene. They had their backs turned, running away, and they were gunned down. And that included my great-great-uncle Thomas. When word spread about the massacre, people came from all over the country by automobile and train to pay their respects. It has been said there was at least 3,000 people in attendance for the funerals that took place in the following days. Some good did come out of the protest because in 1935, President Roosevelt signed into law the National Labor Relations Act, which gave workers more freedom to unionize, bargain, and strike if necessary. However, the general textile strike of 1934 didn't do much for those on strike because they returned to work to support their families with no gain benefits. 2 generations of Honeypath residents had no clue this ever took place until a documentary called The Uprising of 34 was released in 1995. Soon after that massacre took place, the town's elitists used scare tactics to keep people from talking about it. It was almost like it never happened. I did read a couple of interviews of people that said they would, these were like much older people, that they would ask their family or like a grandmother or somebody, to talk about it. And they just like turned them away or like quickly change the subject, or they would just downright say they couldn't or wouldn't talk about it. And I find that really sad. I mean, to like completely wipe something out of the history books, but it did happen. Chicola Mill no longer stands, but before it was destroyed, I had the chance to visit it in August of 2015. I just felt like I had to after I had read that massacre had taken place, and I had a family member that was killed in that massacre. And it probably wasn't safe because it was crumbling and I was probably trespassing, but my soul told me I had to go in. I can remember walking through many rooms that still had desks. I guess they were offices and they still had desks. Some of the desks even had like paperwork still on them. I didn't mess with any of that. There was even some old machinery like mill, like I'm not real familiar with what looms of that nature look like, but I'm assuming they were loom type things. And it was a cotton mill. But as I walked around to the front of the mill, where I was told that my uncle was shot, I suddenly became overwhelmed with emotion. I just stopped like dead in my tracks and I just stood there. And when I closed my eyes, I could hear the gunfire and the chaos that ensued after the gunfire. I mean, I could literally hear people who were frightened beyond belief, scrambling to get away from the gunfire. And I mean, you can't blame them because who knows who would be shot next. And then all of a sudden, I felt a hand on my shoulder. But when I opened my eyes, there was nobody anywhere near around me. And it was a touch that is part comforting and part someone saying it's okay. And I like to think that that was my Uncle Thomas. After I left the area of the mill, I found his and Aunt Leela's grave that day also. Now, that documentary that I mentioned, it can be found on YouTube. I have to say it's not the full documentary. It's basically where some guy that had like it seemed like a public access cable show. I'm not sure, but it was like right before it was released. He and some mill workers were watching that documentary, and we're talking, you know, about what they thought and how things are different now in the textile, or then, because there's not much textile around here anymore. But it was in, I want to say 95 that was recorded, that them critiquing, I guess you could say that. But anyway, you can watch part of that on YouTube, and it's called The Uprising of 34. There's also a book that was written by Frank Beecham, and he was the grandson of Dan Beecham. Now, Frank is a really nice guy, so don't go into it thinking, oh, it was the bad guy's grandson. You know, he wrote this book called Milltown Murder, and I've read it several times just because I was so into it, you know. It's a really good book. It's not very, very long, so you can find it on Amazon, and you can even download it in the Kindle edition and have it the day that you order it. He makes no excuses for his granddad because, like I mentioned earlier, how, you know, people didn't want to talk about it. Well, even when he would bring it up, you know, his parents or grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, would just quickly change the subject. It was a taboo subject, and it was not to be talked about. Now, one thing I should mention that I didn't mention earlier, Dan Beecham, that was the superintendent, and he died 2 years after this happened, so I'm not sure what happened to him, but he didn't live very, very long after that massacre. Now, I'm going to be posting some photos on Facebook today that I took while I was visiting the mill. And also, I have a picture of my aunt and uncle's tombstone. And there's also going to be a photo of, I think it says 1995. I would have to go back and look at the photo. But it was, it's a photo of, like they made this small memorial type thing. I think it's called Dogwood Park. But there's a memorial that has all of the mill workers that were killed. It's got all their names listed on it. Now, I do have to mention, my family of Yarboroughs don't have that extra O after the B. We are Yarbrough. and they misspelled his name on the memorial, and that got a little under my skin, but at least they got the memorial, right? So I'm not going to be picky, but I just did want to point out, if you do notice the spelling on his tombstone and on that memorial. Well, this was a short one. There's a lot more that can be said, but I do like to keep the weekend and the midweek episodes kind of short. Now, you can find, and like I said, I was going to post those pictures on Facebook, and you can find that at facebook.com/3M podcast. And as always, we invite your episode ideas, comments, or questions, and you can send those to 3mpodcast3@gmail.com. Thank you for listening today.